can't remember the last time we had a discussion, public discussion on Canada. It's been a while. The reason for that is Canada has a reputation of being a boring country, a country where nothing ever happens, things move very slow. That's still the case in a lot of ways. But things are getting a bit more exciting, shall we say. That we've seen a number of events in the last period which have represented a change in the situation in Canada. Obviously the most familiar event will be the resignation of our dearly beloved Prime Minister, Governor, Justin Trudeau, who's left office or will be leaving office. And this isn't a small event, by the way. I think Trudeau was the 7th longest serving Prime Minister in Canadian history. There's probably a generation of young people who probably don't have a living memory of any other Prime Minister. Right? I'm a little bit older, not that old, but I remember the Harper years, but that's as far back as I go. But the fact is, he was in power for quite some time, and it does represent a change. But I'll also add that there's been other events, and probably the most important event to happen for Canada in the last period didn't take place in Canada. It's an event that took place in the United States. And I'm referring, of course, to the election of Donald Trump, which has added a whole new dynamic to the situation. Obviously, we've heard about the 25% tariff, which as of now he's still planning to implement for all Canadian and Mexican imports into the United States. He's talked about annexation of Canada, Canada becoming the 51st state. We might talk about that a bit later. I don't have too much time to go into that. Although I will say we just released a very good article today on this question on Marxist.ca, which I'd encourage comrades to read. It's a very good article. But the fact is, if we want to understand what's happening in Canada, we have to go back a little bit and look at the situation in the country, especially the situation in the country over the last few years. Because, you know, it's hard to remember a time when Trudeau was popular. It's hard to imagine that he was ever popular. And yet he was at one point in time. I don't know if people will remember, but in 2015, when he was first elected, he was immensely popular. You know, even something like a celebrity, particularly amongst the youth. I can't remember what the number of youth voting for Trudeau was. I think it was something close to 60% who voted for Trudeau in that election. Now it's much lower. Actually now, the majority of the youth vote is with Poilievre, is with the Conservatives. So we've seen quite a dramatic change over the last 10 years. But we've also seen an immense change in the economic situation in Canada over the last period. That it wouldn't be an exaggeration to say that we're seeing an immense crisis at all levels of Canadian society, political, economic, social, and so on and so forth. You know, one of the justifications for capitalism is that it's supposed to be this rising tide that lifts all boats. That's what they used to say in the glory days of capitalism. There's this idea that, you know, yes, there might be some level of inequality, but everyone will get richer. In other words, you know, your slice of the pie might get a little bit smaller, but the pie itself gets bigger and bigger and bigger. This is the idea, at least. But the fact is, what we've seen over the last period is that the pie has stopped getting bigger. And in fact, in many ways, the pie's been getting smaller and smaller in Canada. You know, the thing is with Trudeau, he's such a vapid individual. It's easy to blame him for everything. You can point to all of these scandals, the WE scandal, the SNC-Lavalin scandal. But the fact is, the truth is, every single one of these prime ministers has had some kind of scandal when they were in office. Paul Martin had the sponsorship scandal. Mulroney had the Airbus scandal. Harper had a million different scandals. The fact is, all of these politicians are the same when it gets down to it. They're all corrupt, and they're all in it for themselves. And the fact is, if we want to understand what's going on, we have to look beyond the individual and look at the economic situation. If you go back a little bit, it's hard to imagine a time when Canada was actually a wealthy country, but it was. After the Second World War, Canada had one of the largest per capita incomes in the world. It was something like third or fourth in the wake of the Second World War. In terms of its military, it had the third largest navy. It had the fourth largest air force. For much of that period, they had close to full employment. It was very easy to find good work, full-time work, with a pension. That was the case for much of the post-war period. But then it started to slow down, especially after the 70s, 80s. That growth started to slow down. But now we've entered a period where not only has the growth begun to slow down, in many ways, the growth has entered into reverse. If you look at GDP's increase on a per capita basis, over the last few periods, it's been going down for the first time in recent memory. But I think, GDP is one thing, but there's other figures we can look at that I think pose this in more graphic terms. I think one of them hasn't been mentioned very often. Life expectancy. For the longest time, life expectancy was increasing year after year, not just in Canada, but in all of the advanced capitalist countries. In fact, that was one of the justifications for capitalism, is that it could allow us to live longer, better lives, more fulfilling lives. What's the reality? Over the last 2 years, not only has the life expectancy started to slow down, over the last 2 years, life expectancy in Canada has gone down for the first time in recent memory. And it's particularly bad in certain parts of the country. If you look at the Indigenous peoples in British Columbia, from 2017 to 2021, their life expectancy dropped by 6 years in a 4-year period. And that's the situation. That's what capitalism in Canada has to offer today. Declining life expectancies. But not just that. There's these people out there, liberals especially, who like to say, well, listen, it's not as bad as you say it is. And they're very clever and very adept at pulling out certain facts and figures to present a certain narrative. There's this whole idea of a vibe session. Freeland talked about this when she was in office. She said, it's not that bad, like people are saying. It's just the vibes are off. It's a vibe session. It shows you why this government was so unpopular, by the way. That you have the finance minister going out and saying, listen, you may all feel this way, but you're wrong. See, I'm an Oxford-educated woman. I know a little bit more than you. That's how it came across to ordinary working people. But the fact is, first of all, the stats do show a decrease. That's the first thing. But second of all, there's lots of things that you can't measure in statistics. You look at what's going on in the city, for example. The state of the cities has never been worse. We see a decay in infrastructure. We see a decay in things like transit. I have to say, the TTC must be the only transit system in the world where it not only hasn't added new lines, it's actually lost a line in the last period. It lost the Scarborough line. I can't think of any other transit system in the world which has actually had negative construction in the last period. And yet the TTC managed to achieve this. We see decaying water infrastructure. We see a homelessness crisis like we've never seen before. We see an opioid crisis like we've never seen before. And you don't need to look at the GDP figures. That's one thing. You just need to look out your own window. And anyone who has eyes and ears to see and to listen can see there's been a decline in living standards, and especially over the last 10 years. That's the situation that we have. And there's many other facts and figures that I could point to. You know, I went, just a small anecdote. I went on a trip a little while ago to Japan. It was the first time I've ever been to Asia. It was a very interesting experience. Now, Japan is a country which has had its own economic crisis. Japan has been suffering from economic stagnation since about the 1990s. But I have to say, it's far more advanced than Canada in many respects. And that's not to say that there aren't problems. There are many problems in Japan. But I have to say, when I came back to Canada, I remember being at Pearson Airport. Anyone who's been to Pearson Airport knows what it's like going to Pearson Airport, how much of a mess that airport is. But I remember just pausing and thinking for a moment, holy shit, excuse my French, we're living in a backwards country. We're the colonial backwater compared to a country like Japan. I think that's the way a lot of people are feeling right now. When they look around and they see the state of the country and the state of their own situation. But like I said, it's easy to blame Trudeau. And again, all of these things are true. You know, that he's vapid, that he's incompetent, that he's an idiot. I mean, I'm not going to disagree with any of those characterizations. But you know, I'm a big fan of the American comedian George Carlin. I don't know if anyone's familiar with him. And he used to say, you know, it's not just the politicians. He said we need to look at what he called the real owners. The real owners. And what did he mean? He meant the bankers. He meant the owners of the oil companies. He meant the owners of the telecoms companies. These people. In other words, the capitalist class in Canada. Of course, in his case, he was talking about the United States. The owners of these people, the families that own these companies, the Rogers family, the Weston family, these sorts of people who dominate the Canadian economy. At the end of the day, they are the ones who've destroyed the country. They're the ones who destroyed the country. Just take one issue, the question of immigration. Again, you read the newspaper, you think it was just all a mistake. You know, this whole thing of, too many immigrants coming, driving up the housing prices, so on and so forth. You know, it's all Trudeau. He's just a fool, you see. He just doesn't understand basic economics. But what's the truth of the matter? Who were the ones demanding to expand the temporary foreign worker program? It wasn't just the politicians. It was the business community who for years were demanding an expansion to this system. Why is that? You see, there's two ways that you can make money under capitalism. One is that you invest in technology, you invest in production, new machines, new techniques, and so on and so forth. You beat the competition. That's one way. The other way is you drive down wages, you drive down conditions, you drive your workers into the ground, and you make profits that way. For the last period, that's how the capitalists in Canada have chosen to make their money. Not to invest in research and development, not to invest in technology and production, but to drive down the wages of the working class. And they like temporary foreign workers because they have no rights, they're tied to one employer, they can work them to the bone, and so they make a lot of money. They were the ones doing this. They were the ones pushing for this. And then of course, when the backlash came, they weren't the ones who shouldered the blame. No, it's the immigrants' fault. Oh, it's all the students from India, they shouldn't have come here. They're the ones to blame. Not so. Not so. Listen, I believe in classical bourgeois economics, which states that there should be a free movement of labor. That's what I believe in. There's nothing wrong with someone coming here to seek out a better life for their family. What's wrong with that? There are resources in this country to provide for everyone who's living here. But it was the capitalists that mismanaged the situation, brought people here, but didn't support the people that they brought here. Of course, they're not the ones who have to deal with the consequences. They all live in nice, posh homes. They're totally insulated from the consequences. But they were the ones who created this situation. I'll give another example. We have the issue of housing. Housing. Canada has probably one of the most overinflated housing markets in the world. You've seen it. The increase in rents, the amount that people are paying towards their mortgages. I mean, I don't need to give you the facts and figures. You live it. You've seen it for yourself. But again, why are we in this situation? Again, you read the newspapers, you think it's all just Trudeau's stupidity. That's how they explain it. He's just an idiot, right? Or, you know, or maybe you change the zoning regulation and that will fix the problem. Well, no, I think it's far deeper than that. I think it's far deeper than that. We have a situation now where something like 20% of Canadian GDP is tied up in real estate. That's the highest level that it's ever been, as far as I know, in Canadian history. You also have something like 10% of the Canadian workforce tied up in residential construction. So it consumes a huge amount of the country's resources. You think 20% of GDP, they must be building homes up the wazoo, but they haven't been. In fact, the Canadian Mortgage Housing Corporation says we need to build something like 3 million homes in the next few years in order to address the housing crisis, which means something like doubling or tripling the current pace of housing construction. But in the last period, in Ontario, not only have housing starts not gone up, they've gone down in the last period. They've gone down. Why is this? Because even though it makes up such an enormous share of the GDP, it's one of the least productive sectors in the Canadian economy. They're using the same methods to build homes that they were using 30 years ago. There's absolutely been no innovation, no advancement of production whatsoever. You have essentially a layer of developers and bankers who have become a huge parasite on the Canadian economy, who are bleeding the country dry, driving down people's wages, and sending the country down the tubes. There's been absolutely no innovation. They're good at some things. They're very good at building luxury condos, for example, because that churns a very easy profit. But they've been very, very bad at building things like low-income housing that working class people can afford. Now, it's been very good for a few people. It's been very good for the bankers. They've been making record profits in the last period. It's been very good for luxury condo developers, but it's been very, very bad for everybody else. You know, there was a period in time where Canada was building a large amount of housing. That was in the period after the Second World War. And actually, during that period, it's not the case today, but the federal government was actually involved in building public housing back then. I think they got out of that in the 80s or in the 90s. But at that time, they were able to build large amounts of homes for working class people. And why? There were a lot of problems with that system. But why were they able to do that? Because the private market was not a factor. This is the thing. In North America, you have an incredibly large amount of the housing market that's tied up in the private sector, probably more than any other part of the world. But the housing crisis is probably not as bad anywhere else than it is in North America. Why? Because the market has failed to build housing. It can't build housing because it's not profitable to build housing for working class people. So these people have failed. It's more than just Trudeau. It's more than just the Liberal Party. It's the whole system which has had an impasse and which has failed to take the country forward. So this is the situation. I mean, we can go on and on and on describing the situation in the country. This was the situation before Trump. Now, Trump has been re-elected to a second term. This is going to massively aggravate the situation that exists in the country. Will massively aggravate. But I want to be perfectly clear. Trump will aggravate the crisis. That's true. But he didn't create the crisis. You know, guaranteed in the next period there's going to be a lot of people in the Liberal Party and elsewhere who are going to say, well, everything was fine before Trump came in. Not so. The problems in this country are homegrown. Wasn't Trump that destroyed the country? He'll play a role. But it was the rich and powerful, the bankers and industrialists in this country who destroyed this country, who brought it to this position. You know, I like to use the analogy of an earthquake. Because when an earthquake happens, if you've invested in sound infrastructure, then the impact that that earthquake has is going to be minimal. But if you've systematically underfunded infrastructure for decades, cut costs at every level, and the result being that you have a shoddy infrastructure, then the earthquake is going to blow you to smithereens. And that's exactly what happened. Trump is the earthquake, and Canada has been built on unstable foundations, which is why it's going to have such a dramatic impact. And a dramatic impact it will have. Because the fact is, there are no two countries in the world that are as tied together economically as the United States. Something like 77% of Canadian exports are destined for the US market. If you put a 25% tariff on 77%, hundreds of billions of goods going to the United States, what you're talking about is an immediate and very deep recession in Canada. Actually, Ford came out the other day. He said that it could be up to 500,000 jobs in Ontario alone that would be affected by the tariffs. Now, I don't know how accurate that figure is, but I say it's probably not far off of the mark. Because what you're talking about is a massive collapse of GDP, which will mean closures of factories, layoffs of working class people, devastation of working class communities on a scale that we haven't seen for many decades. Probably the closest analogy that you could point to is the situation in Canada in the Great Depression. I can't think of another scenario in Canadian history that would come close. That's the situation that we're facing. And to be honest, there isn't a ship of the captain in Canada at the moment. Not so. They don't have a policy. And in fact, for all intents and purposes, we don't have a government at the time being. Probably during the most serious crisis in Canada's modern history. No policy and no government. It's a very interesting situation. And to be honest, I think a layer of the ruling class has become a bit deluded in terms of Trump. You know, they've sort of deluded themselves into believing, oh, you know, he doesn't mean what he's saying. You know, he's just, you know, it's just the art of the deal. He's not going to actually introduce tariffs. We're two close friends, you know, we're historical allies. Would he throw all of that away? What's the reality here? You know, I was thinking, Trump, he's a very interesting person. Say what you will about him, and there's a lot you could say about him. He's a very interesting character. But you know, I think it was Shakespeare that said, though it be madness, yet it has a method in it. And I think that applies to someone like Donald Trump. You know, you hear the kind of things he says and you think, this guy is a raving lunatic. There's an element to that. But there's also a logic to some of the things that he's saying. That there's a definite policy that underpins the Trump presidency. It's not just lunacy. It represents a definite policy. And that policy is protectionism and isolationism. And actually, those two things have a very long-standing history in the United States. This whole idea of America first, you know, this is how Trump poses the question. America first, yes, but America first also means everybody else has to come last. That's the flip side to that equation. Trump has this idea that the United States has done so much for the world, and everybody is ripping the United States off. And the only way to claw some of that back is through tariffs. And yeah, on this question of tariffs, I do genuinely think he believes in tariffs and in the advantage of tariffs. I think, yeah, it was on, was it the Joe Rogan podcast where he said, you know, that tariff just might be the most beautiful word in the dictionary, is how Trump described it. he's talked about this. He's talked about a period in United States history where they didn't have an income tax and all government revenues were made through tariffs. And he said, oh, maybe we should consider something like this. Again, actually just the other day, you might be familiar with the Internal Revenue Service, which is used to collect income tax. But Trump's now said he's going to create the External Revenue Service, which should be used to collect the tariffs. So I do genuinely think he believes in this. You know, if you think it's just all bluster, I think you might be in for a surprise. I think you might be in for a surprise. I think he's quite serious when he talks about these things. There's another element which you can describe as the sheer arrogance of the Canadian ruling class. You know, we've seen a bit of a revival of Canadian nationalism over the last few days. I read a really cringy article by Jean Chrétien. You know who Jean Chrétien is, our former Prime Minister. He wrote an editorial for the Globe and Mail saying, listen, Canada is the greatest country in the world, even better than the United States. We have all of our great history, our great traditions, and so on and so forth. This whole idea that, you know, essentially that Trump wouldn't throw that away. He values that friendship. He values Canada, and so on and so forth. In fact, he actually called for Canada to go on the offensive. He said, not only should we play a defensive war, we should play an offensive war. Start attacking the United States a little bit. I have to say, I don't know if these people have ever looked at the American economy, compared it with the Canadian economy. There's a little bit of a difference between the two. There's a little bit of a difference. Because what you're looking at is the largest superpower in the world, with the most powerful military, with the most powerful economy, and Canada, which is sort of the junior partner, if you will, of US imperialism. A much smaller population, a much smaller economy. The fact is, there is no situation, absolutely no situation, where Canada would ever win a trade war against the United States. Anyone who believes that needs to be given a slap, because they're clearly dreaming. There is no situation where Canada would ever win a trade war against the United States. And again, incredible delusions. I read another editorial the other day. This one was by a university professor. And he thought he might share his ideas on how Canada can fight back against the United States. And he had some advice for Trudeau. He said, well, what Trudeau should do is phone up Donald Trump at the White House and tell him in forceful language that he should stop what he's doing. I'm not exaggerating. You can read the article. That was the sum total of his suggestion. Call him on the phone and tell him to stop. Tell him to reconsider what he was doing. You know, that's the level of intellect it requires to be a tenured professor these days. That's a separate point. But these are the kinds of ridiculous ideas being proposed. The fact is that there's absolutely no way out. There's a situation where Canada, the Canadian ruling class, is damned if they do and damned if they don't. That's the situation facing the Canadian ruling class. And it's also played a role in the downfall of the Trudeau government. Again, we don't have time to go into it. But remember, one of the reasons that Freeland left was on disagreement over policy in relation to Trump. So in that sense, you can say that what's happened in the United States has also precipitated the political crisis in Canada. But we've seen some interesting moves over the last period, because the response of the Canadian government has been contradictory. That in some ways they've conceded to Trump, and in other ways they've tried to go on the offensive. In terms of making concessions to Trump, you saw this with the border. You know, Trump made his tweet, or whatever, Truth Social, I think, is where he posted it, the tariff threat. Within a few days, Justin Trudeau was at Mar-a-Lago, a half discussion with Donald Trump. And just a few days after that, they suddenly announced that they're going to be spending $1.3 billion more on the border. And by the way, it wasn't just the Trudeau government, but also the NDP. You know, the NDP likes to fancy itself a left-wing party. I don't know about that. Actually, the Wabkinew governments, the Manitoba NDP government, actually had its conservation officials redeployed as border guards. That was the NDP doing that. They said, go guard the border and make sure no immigrants are going across. An NDP government was doing that. So they've all been groveling before Trump. But then they've also started to move in the other direction. And they've now started to discuss retaliatory tariffs against Trump. We actually had a meeting the other day. I think it was on Wednesday, which was a meeting of Trudeau and all of the different premiers. And you might have seen Doug Ford. He came with a cute little hat which said, Canada is not for sale. Very cute little, it didn't fit him very well. But it was a very cute little hat. Oh, but it's a bit ironic though. Canada's not for sale. Do you remember something called the Greenbelt scandal? Do you remember that? The Greenbelt scandal with the Ford government, where they opened up public land and sold it to a bunch of his developer friends at a very, very steep discount. So actually, no, Canada is for sale, but it's not for sale to Trump. It's for sale to the rich and powerful who are friends with the Ford government. So anyway, that's a separate point. But to speak of hypocrisy. But the fact is, what this meeting revealed is that there are serious divisions in the Canadian ruling class and between the Canadian provinces on the approach to Trump. You see a much more aggressive stance from Doug Ford at the moment. But you see something very interesting in the West. You have Danielle Smith, the Premier of Alberta, who came out, actually they issued a memorandum after this conference. Every single Premier signed it except for one. Danielle Smith didn't sign the memorandum. You know, they like to talk about Team Canada. I don't know about that. Maybe the first time around they had a bit of a Team Canada. But this time it's not much of a team. What you see is all the provinces slowly starting to move in their own direction. And you're seeing it first with Alberta. Because what's happening with Alberta is that actually Danielle Smith, I don't know if you saw, she also paid a visit to Mar-a-Lago. This was, I think, about a week ago. And not just her, she was joined by Kevin O'Leary. You might remember from, what's the show? Is it Shark Tank? Kevin O'Leary, that idiot, is the one his wife killed somebody with a boat, right? Yeah. But a lot of people think it was him. But anyway, he's an idiot. And then Jordan Peterson, who's maybe even a bigger idiot, all together at Mar-a-Lago. You might be wondering, what's she doing there? What's she doing there? She's also said that she's going to attend the inauguration. It's very clear what's happening here. It's very clear. She's left Team Canada. She's left Team Canada. She's looking to get a carve-out for the Albertan oil barons. This is what she's trying to do. Because the fact is, the United States is not dependent on Canada for a great many things. But there's a few things where they have a greater dependence. And those things are resources. Oil, gas, critical minerals. Potash is a big one. You know, potash is used in fertilizer. The United States gets 90% of its potash from Saskatchewan. 90%. The other 10% or so came from Russia. There's very few places where they can access it and access it easily. That's true for a lot of critical minerals. It's also true of lumber to a certain degree. This is the one thing they need. What Danielle Smith is trying to do is to essentially secure a carve-out of that sector of the Canadian economy, and the auto industry and the rest of them, the other capitalists, can go to the devil. This is essentially the approach that we see being taken. And you're beginning to see, like I said, these divisions. Actually, it's a very strange thing. You know, a lot of people like to say, you know, all the political parties in Canada as very different from one another. The Conservatives, the Liberals, the NDP. But you're seeing a very interesting thing happen at these negotiations. Because you had an NDP government in BC, which came out in support of Danielle Smith. Isn't that interesting? A Conservative government being supported by an NDP government, but being opposed by Doug Ford, who's another Conservative. What's happening here? The fact is, these politicians, can talk till the cows come home about their principles and so on and so forth. When it comes to the interests of their own capitalists, all of those principles go out the window. And that's exactly what you're seeing happen. They're all trying to secure a place for themselves, and the rest of the country be damned, in order to secure the interests of their own capitalists. This is the process beginning to play out in Canada. It was actually a process that was already beginning to play out. This whole idea of the breakup of Canadian Confederation. You know, it's a very tenuous thing, by the way, Canadian Confederation. We never had a revolution, a bourgeois revolution in Canada. It's usually kind of seen as a virtue. You know, we're not like those pesky Americans who had all these wars, all these revolutions. No, no. We're a gradual country. We believe in negotiation in this country. That's how they see it. But the fact is, because of that legacy, Canada never had the same internal cohesion as a country like the United States. It was a country based on fault lines. It was a country based on divisions. Just an interesting fact. Do you know there's actually more trade barriers between the Canadian provinces than there are between the states of the European Union? That's a fact. That's how divided the country is. And Trump knows this. You know, again, people think he's a bit insane. He's very clever as well in a lot of ways. And he's now taking advantage of these divisions to turn one province against another and get what he wants in the interest of the US ruling class. This is the situation that we see unfolding. It's crises at every turn. And this is the situation that Mr. Pierre Poilievre is going to inherit. Well, I don't like to call him Pierre Poilievre. I like the new name. They now call him PP. You heard it, it's, you know, the acronym PP. That PP is going to inherit, Pierre Poilievre. You know, I think, to be honest, I think he was feeling very excited to be Prime Minister until recently. Then Trump got elected. And now, to be honest, I can't speak for him. I can't go into his psyche. I think he's pretty nervous right now. I think he's probably sweating bullets, thinking about how he's going to manage this situation. Because the fact is, well, first of all, to respond to a point, because there's this idea with the popularity of Pierre Poilievre. There's this idea that you hear that Canada has turned to the right. I don't know if you've heard this. You know, people are turning to the right. You know, they're looking towards racists and reactionaries and so on and so forth. Canadian society is shifting to the right. But to be honest, I think that's a superficial understanding of what's happening in Canada. First of all, there's very little difference between the Liberal Party of Canada and the Conservative Party of Canada on fundamental issues. You know, there's an American author, his name was Gore Vidal, a very good writer, one of the great American writers. He used to have a very famous saying, talking about the United States. He said, in the United States, we have one party, the Property Party, with two right wings, the Republicans and the Democrats. I think that applies just the same to Canada, to be honest, with the Conservative Party and with the Liberal Party, that on all of the fundamental issues, they're in almost perfect agreement. You take the issue of immigration, for example, the temporary foreign worker program. What's the fact? Both parties supported the expansion and the exploitation of immigrant workers. You have to remember that Trudeau, yes, expanded the system, but so did Stephen Harper. Stephen Harper also expanded that system until it became politically inconvenient, and then both parties turned against it. The fact is they moved almost in tandem with each other. On the question of the border now, spending money on the border, they're almost in perfect alignment with one another on all of the fundamental issues. The only issues where they disagree is arguably on secondary issues. The main one is the carbon tax, which, to be honest, is a very secondary question. It represents a very small factor in the broader picture of Canadian politics. But on all of the fundamental issues, they agree. One other example, the labor movement There's this idea, I don't know where people get it from, this idea that the Liberal Party is somehow pro-labor. They support the trade unions, they support the working class. What a load of rubbish. What a load of crap. Name one strike in the last period, one major strike in the last period that hasn't been crushed by the Liberals. There hasn't been a single major strike that hasn't been crushed by the Liberal Party. At least in the past, they at least had the decorum to do it through Parliament. We'll have a little vote, we'll pretend that we disagree, and then we'll take away the working class's right to strike. They don't even have the decorum to do that anymore. Now they go to the CIRB, essentially executive order. They don't even debate it anymore. They've just taken away their right to strike. They did it to the railway workers, and they've done it to the postal workers, and a few others too. On this issue, the Conservatives and the Liberals are in alignment. They did the same that Harper did. They did worse than what Harper did. That's what the Liberals represent. But the fact is, with someone like Pierre Poilievre, he's a bit like Trump in some ways. He's a very clever opportunist. A very clever opportunist. Because let me be perfectly clear. The Conservative Party and Pierre Poilievre are just as much enemies of the working class as the Liberal Party is. Let's make that perfectly clear. And he likes to prattle on about, I'm against the elites and so on. He's never worked a real job. This whole life has been spent as a career politician. Ever since he was 25 years old, he's been in Parliament. He's been a career politician. He has no understanding what it means to be a working class person. You better believe it. But he's an opportunist, and he's a good opportunist. And he's managed to position himself as a voice of the working class. In fact, he actually uses the term working class, which is a new thing in Canadian politics. It also always used to be the middle class. We're all middle class, middle class, middle class. He's used the language working class, and it's had a certain effect. He talks about going after the gatekeepers. He talks about going after the elite, and so on and so forth. And they've taken this quite far, by the way. Again, on the question of labor, there was a legislation before the Parliament, I think about a year or two ago now, anti-scab legislation. It would have made it difficult to bring in replacement workers into a workplace during a strike. In the past, the Conservative Party would have always voted against legislation like that. But what did they do this time? They voted in favor of that legislation. This is the kind of game that he's playing. But like I said, we don't fall for it because it is a masquerade. It is a masquerade. For example, he's already talked about cutting the Canada Child Benefit, probably the only half-decent reform that the Liberals introduced. It led to a reduction in child poverty. They're going to get rid of that. And I don't think that's the end of the programs that they're going to cut and the attacks that they're going to make on the Canadian working class. But like I said, Pierre Poilievre will represent a government of crisis from day one. And I think he's pretty nervous about becoming Prime Minister. Because the fact is that there's very little room for Pierre Poilievre to maneuver in response to Trump. In fact, I listened to some of his interviews. I don't know if you've had the misfortune of listening to this guy speak, but I've heard them. This was after the tariff threat. And I asked him, what are you going to do about Trump? What are you going to do differently than Trudeau? And he prattled on and on and on. He said, well, I'm going to remove the carbon tax. I'm going to axe the tax. And this is going to unleash the free market in Canada. And then we'll be in a very different situation. I thought, how much of an idiot must this guy be to think that such a marginal thing as the carbon tax is going to defeat the United States of America? What a fool. This guy has absolutely no idea what he's going to do. Absolutely no idea what he's going to do. The other day he came out and said he's going to support the tariffs. But again, it's absolutely impossible for Canada to win a tariff war against the United States. There's a possibility that he might align with Danielle Smith and say, well, listen, leave our resources alone. We'll send you oil. We'll send you gas. We'll send you critical minerals. We'll be a good, loyal partner. And just don't destroy our country. Don't destroy our economy. He might take that. It's hard to say. He's been very coy about what he's actually going to do. But if he takes that step, it won't be long till the East turns against him. And I'll say this now, if he sides with Danielle Smith, Ford will turn against him, absolutely. Absolutely he will. Because the fact is, he's inheriting a country built on division. Built on division. No matter which way he turns, he's going to run up against a brick wall. You know, there's it's sometimes called the Tacitus trap, referring to the Roman emperor. This whole idea that no matter what you do, you lose. You move in this direction, you're smashed. You move in that direction, you're smashed. That's the situation that Pierre Poilievre is going to inherit. And I'll make a prediction now that it's going to be a very short honeymoon that people have with this government. It's not going to be 10 years like we had with Trudeau. I think it's going to be a very, very short honeymoon. But just to bring things to some kind of a conclusion, because I've talked a lot about the politics, the divisions in the country, the United States, Canada, the economy, and so on and so forth. But in all of these discussions, there's been one factor that's absent. If you watch the news, or if you read the newspapers, there's one factor that's been absent in all of these discussions. And that factor is the working class. They don't talk about the working class and that the interests of the working class in this debate. And that's one thing that unites all of these politicians, is they like to present themselves as, well, we stand up for Canadians. We stand up for Canadians. But then you have to pose the question, which Canadians? Which Canadians? Are the interests of all Canadians the same? Well, I would beg to differ with that. I would beg to differ. Does a Canadian worker, for example, benefit from the domination of Rogers, Bell, and TELUS? They're Canadian, homegrown companies, proud Canadian institutions. Do they serve in the interests of Canadians? Does it make a difference to an ordinary Canadian worker whether they get their phone bill from an American company or Rogers and Bell? I disagree. The fact is that these Canadian companies have been screwing over Canadians for years. They've been gouging Canadian workers for years. They say, well, at least they'll create jobs. An American company won't create the jobs. And I beg to differ. Bell, if you remember, just about a year ago, laid off 9% of its workforce. Thousands of workers were laid off by Bell. In fact, I know a number of people personally who were affected by those layoffs. And you know how they treated them? They told them on the same day, they called them into a meeting, they brought them all in together, they read a prepared statement lasting 1 minute and 30 seconds, and it ended by saying, we're very sorry, we're going to be sending you a box, pack all your things in it, and send it back to Bell. And that was it. And then the meeting was over. That's your Team Canada for you. That's your Team Canada for you, all one Canadian people. That's a load of crap. That's a load of crap. Because the fact is there are also divisions within Canada. And the interests of the telcos and the oil companies and the banks is not the same as it is with the Canadian workers. And it's perfectly true to say, he's talked about Trump annexation. That also won't be a solution. And Canadian workers have every reason to worry about that. I've heard people say, well, listen, I don't want to lose health care. Single-payer health care. That's the one thing we have that they don't have. And that's perfectly true. And I can understand that. But also, I'd remind you, they're also destroying health care now. In this country, you have 6.5 million Canadians who don't have a primary doctor. You've got hallway medicine. You've got ER shutting down in small towns across the country. You had a story the other day of a guy who died in the waiting room because it took too long for them to actually treat him. And this is happening now every few months in the country. The fact is, No, it wouldn't be good to join the United States, Trump to absorb, Canada. But also, the situation at present is also no solution. That this whole debate doesn't interest the working class. Because either way, the working class loses. Whether it's the Canadian capitalists that win out or the American capitalists that win out. At the end of the day, it's the working class who gets shifted. That's the fact of the matter. That's the fact of the matter. Now what we need is to use the resources of this huge continent. You know, there is a certain logic to this idea of integration, I have to say. You know, that if you look at the nature of trade, and the economy, labor, the movement moves from north to south. It doesn't move from east to west. It doesn't make sense to divide up the continent in that way. Of course, on a capitalist basis. But on the basis of a planned economy, democratically controlled by the working class, you can use all of the immense resources of that continent and use it to invest in the things that working people need. Invest in education, invest in new technologies, invest in new production. Use it to massively raise the standard of living of the Canadian workers and the American workers. There's an incredible potential there, but it's been thrown away because of the inefficiencies of the market and because of the barriers of the nation state. I have to say, when Trump says it's an artificial line at the end of the day, there's an element of truth to that. Because those are our brothers and sisters in the United States. Our qualms are not with them. Our qualms are with the rich and powerful in the United States and Canada. That's who our enemy is. And it's the American workers that are our ally in this situation. So the perspective is one of total transformation. That's the only way out. Of total socialist transformation of the economy to lift the standards of living of the working class. And that might seem a far-fetched idea. You might say, it's too extreme. It's too extreme for people. They never support such a thing. And I'll admit that Marxism is still a very marginal force in society. It's not a lot of people that would consider themselves a communist. That's perfectly true. Yes, it's an extreme idea in some ways, but we're also living in very extreme times. Look at what's happening in the world. You're seeing extreme suffering in the world. Look at what's happened in Gaza. Look at what's happened in Sudan. Look at what's happened all around the world. Extreme suffering like we haven't seen in a generation. You're seeing extreme natural crises that we haven't seen in a generation. LA has burned. LA is on fire. You have people losing their homes. You have people dying in one of the wealthiest cities in the world. And all of these things are becoming more and more common. And you're seeing extreme suffering everywhere. Just look outside. Extreme suffering like we've never seen. So no, I don't think our ideas are extreme. The fact is, it's the only solution. And people will look to these ideas because they see no other way out. Because all of the establishment politicians offer absolutely no solutions. And yes, there'll be a layer that turns to the far right, of course. But there will also be a layer, particularly of young people, who will turn to the ideas of Marxism and communism. And you can see it already bubbling under the surface. Because I've talked about, Polyev. He's having a bit of popularity right now. But he's not the only popular figure in North America at the moment. Oh, there's another one. It's Luigi. Luigi, not from Super Mario Brothers. That Luigi. That Luigi. Now, of course, as Marxists, we're not advocates of, going out and murdering people. These aren't our methods. Not for moral reasons, but because that's not the way you change the system. You kill one of these people, they'll be replaced by somebody else. That's the fact of the matter. But yes, there's an interesting thing which happened. They did a poll a little while ago. I don't know if you saw this poll. Something like 40% of American youth said that to one degree or another, they supported his actions. They supported his actions. Now you talk about extreme. That is the situation that exists amongst the Canadian youth. And I can guarantee you, there's a layer of young people in Canada who think exactly the same way. They're looking for these kinds of ideas. And it's our responsibility as revolutionaries, as people who want to transform society, to find these young people and give them ideas, to say there is a way out. You don't need to resort to desperate acts of terror. You can organize, you can build something, and you can change the world. That's the message that we put out there, and that's our task. It's a very exciting period that's opening up in front of us. And we can change the world if we organize, if we have the ideas. That's our perspective. So I'll leave it there.